Welcome to the Paru Zings Appraisers on Purpose podcast. This podcast showcases inspiring appraisers and professionals from the industry who are leaders in their field. How did they get to where they are? What have they learned along the way? And what do they do now for their teams, their clients, and the industry? Your host is real estate investor, entrepreneur, and appraiser, Michael Hobbs.
So again, welcome to our second episode with Tim Hansen. There was just so much that we wanted to break it into two to have a little more opportunity to go in further depth and hear the type of stories that professional appraisers can really appreciate that maybe you've experienced and probably haven't, and that come about from not only working at the county level or the state level, but also the federal level and covering large number of jurisdictions and territories. So with that, Tim, thanks so much for an extended session here. And again, thanks for what you do for the profession. And you shared briefly in our last episode about not only how you progressed to where you're at, but what your, the responsibility you have, what you're all doing to help ensure some perpetuity of the profession and the important role that valuation plays. Because, this country was founded on a legal construct. And appraisal very much sits inside of that. The valuation of land and property rights is key. And a lot of people may be a little less in touch with that important reason that we left Europe and came over here and kicked things off.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. And one of the things I always tell people when they ask, well, first of all, I get a lot of times people say, I didn't know the government had appraisers. And it's like, yeah, there's a fair number of us, probably not enough to handle the workload, but there's a fair number of us. And if you think about it, anytime the government buys, sells, trades, leases, permits, any type of land use, it's usually done at fair market value to ensure that, the taxpayers get a reasonable return on the use of public lands or federal lands. So there's a lot of different aspects we get into out there. And so we have a big staff. I think I mentioned that before, that we're about 115 appraisers right now. But what I don't know that I mentioned is we do about 4,000 assignments a year across 115 appraisal staff members. And that includes all of our clients. And so those can be very, very different and very interesting, sometimes very unique as far as what we encounter and what we have to deal with.
That is a phenomenal quantity of appraisals. Now, granted, if somebody's working in a national firm, they're accustomed to doing high volume work, but this is not high volume repetitive work. This is just a high volume of, I would interpret, generally unique circumstances. I mean, there's probably falls into several domains, but not everybody's going out dealing with beehives or vast sections of water that being valued for a particular purpose, or, identifying some amount of land acquisition that might be wetlands for expansion of a federal green space. I mean, the breadth of assignments you all cover is staggering.
Yeah, it is. And it does vary. I mean, there are some that are fairly routine. We, especially our work in Indian country, we do a lot of agricultural leasing appraisals where we determine the amount of rent that should be paid for the use of that individual Indian landowner's land for the next planting season or growing season or grazing season, whatever it happens to be. Those can be fairly routine, but where we get into some really interesting things you don't think about. And it's like one of the situations, my first assignment as a federal employee was to figure out how much rent to charge someone for placing beehives on a chunk of BLM land in Colorado.
That is fascinating. I mean, think about that. Somebody comes to you and says, hey, I heard you do appraisal. You're like, yeah. They're like, hey, could you help me out? I need to figure out some rent. You're like, I think I could do that. They're like, oh, what is it? And you're like, it's beehives. And they're like, it's what? Is that a certain style of property? You're like, no, not exactly.
And it's funny, it's this whole idea of everything's interrelated, but we were asked to determine what we should charge for, what BLM should charge for rent for placing these beehives on public land. And so I thought, well, all right, how do I tackle this? So this was, early 2000s. So the internet wasn't what it is now, but it was there. And so I started kind of doing some research online and started calling different offices in different parts of the state. And I knew from my experience at the truck stop that if you listened to the first podcast, you heard about that. When we had the truck stop, we would have semi loads of beehives come through the truck stop. And so I knew they were trucking these things across the country.
Yeah.
And
I didn't know that.
yeah, I mean, they would come in and it would be seasonal, usually spring and fall. And, mostly they would be coming from California to somewhere else in the summer and then back to California in the wintertime. And so in my mind, I'm thinking there's got to be some information out there. If it's lucrative enough for them to truck these things across the country, then there's got to be something about rent. And so as I started digging, I got in contact with some of our staff in California, and they're like, yeah, we do apiary rentals all the time. And so we found out, well, part of it is sometimes it's a very unique use, but what you have to distill it down to is like, okay, well, what are we really permitting there? We're allowing this person to do something on this land for a period of time. And that may be no different than, a grazing lease or a temporary construction easement or, a lot of the things we're more familiar with. It just happened to be beehives. And there was an actual market for beehives. And some landowners would actually pay to have the beehives installed rather than charging rent, because it was actually a benefit as pollinators to try and help their crops do better. So it was almost like an inverse, that relationship was almost inverse because the landowners were actually paying for the beehives. But on federal land, there weren't any crops. They just happened to be adjacent to maybe some crops, but we had to charge for what the rent would be for the federal land that was being used. So the public got the return on the use that are entitled to. And so that was a good indoctrination into like some of the studies that I would undertake throughout my career. It's like, okay, well, this is something I'm not familiar with, but how do I figure out how to come up with a number that's defensible and credible for the use?
That is such an interesting, appropriate zoom out type of perspective evaluation. I can literally recall a conversation yesterday with a team member who was asking about picking between some competing properties as part of the valuation. And first question asked, I said, hey, what was the highest and best use of land? Like what's actually being done here? And as you are reminding us that it really is about, even in unique assignments, the use may be unique, but what's really going on? And that is someone that wants to do or not do something for some amount of time involving land or property rights. And then taking that approach, you can actually step into something that may be unfamiliar or unusual, but can be solved.
Right. Yeah, we have another case of that going on, right now, where there's a heightened interest in the use of pore space underground for storage of carbon dioxide or disposal of, water from oil and gas operations or those types of things. And so initially people get really hung up about, well, it's pore space and it's going to be this particular use. And, as I kind of tried to zoom out, like you said, and think about what is it we're really doing, and kind of the idea I kind of came up with that resonated was, this is like an underground warehouse. Basically, you can put whatever you want in it, but we're going to charge you a certain amount to store your stuff in our warehouse. It just happens to be pore space underground. And so when you look at it from that perspective, there is market evidence out there of the use of pore space. And there has been for many, many years to do, like, there's one, in the Pennsylvania, New York area where they're storing natural gas underground, buy low, store it, pump it out once the market improves, sell it at a higher amount.
Wow.
Those kind of things. So there is some history of that. There's also a lot, with these produced water wells where oil and gas development dewaters coal bed methane seams, and they have to do something with the water. Well, what do they do with the water? I mean, it depends on the quality of the water, but sometimes it's the best use of it is to pump it back into these deep storage reservoirs underground. If it's under federal land, then the government gets a return on that for that use of their, part of their property.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. As you touched on, again, for those that have never done unusual or even eccentric type evaluation, it's about looking for market evidence for a similar use. And similar has a very broad range, as opposed to, I was literally in a conversation later last night with a client we work with, and he was asking about valuation of former fast food properties along or in very close proximity, if not visibility from an interstate, that can now be used for cannabis purposes because it's legal now in the state he's in. And he's like, well, I need that particular thing. I'm like, well, maybe and maybe not. I'm like, let's really get to the core of what's going on here. And in his case, he talked about some unique characteristics of the lending requirements, because it was a lending assignment, and arm's length transactions, can't be related parties. But nonetheless, it's all about getting down to the component pieces. And I'm really reminded of that here.
One of my favorite stories related to that was, I don't know if you're familiar with the artist Christo and those landscape scale art installations. He's done them in Paris and New York, Central Park. And there was one proposed here in Colorado on the Arkansas River where they were going to run cables across the river and drape the Arkansas River with fabric as this art installation. And of course, everybody immediately went, like you said, to the idea of, oh my gosh, how are we going to find comparable art installations to come up with a rent for, or basically a fee for them to use public lands to do this? And that went around for a while. And I said, well, what is it we're actually doing? They're drilling holes to put anchors in the rocks. They're putting braces up. They're running cable across the river. This is more of an industrial type use than an art installation. And we had evidence for different types of industrial use. We had market evidence. And so part of it was reframing that to get away from the idea that this is an art installation, which it is, but what is the real actual function that's happening on the ground? And it's more industrial. And we were able to, that we had done by a contract appraiser, and ended up getting a really good appraisal that got us where we needed to be. But we had to kind of think about, how are we going to address this? How are we going to kind of reframe this away from an art installation to be something that there might be market evidence for?
And to give people just some perspective of what that installation was going to be, what was the scale of the installation? Not everybody knows about the Arkansas River.
Yeah, I think it was about, if I recall, it's been a few years ago, but it was about, I want to say like 23 miles of the river.
Yeah, I say it's not like, hey, we're going to do like a little billboard, and it's going to be, a couple meters tall and several meters wide. Like, we're not talking something like that.
Right. It was like in multiple sections along the river, and, they varied in length, but I think the total project area, I want to say, was about 23 miles long. And I can't remember the number of braces and cables. It wasn't, they were spaced out a fair amount. Just, I think they had done it so that they could drape the fabric, but it wouldn't sag enough to fall in the river, but, it would still create this like canopy effect over the river. And then, there was going to be viewing from the highways and different places where they were going to have observation points, things like that. I don't think it ever came to pass, and Christo has since passed away. And we did get the appraisal done, and we did our part, but it for other reasons, I don't think it ever got approved to be installed. But those are the kind of things that are very unique and challenging, and kind of make you scratch your head and keep you engaged, because you're like, I got to think about how am I gonna do this. I had one other one that was really interesting where I got a call. They said, we have a group or an individual that wants to go out on public land and collect meteorites, and we need to know how much to charge them. And I said, well, okay, couple things. One, are you charging them for the materials they pick up, or are you charging them for the right to go out and pick them up, or are you charging them for both? And, maybe it's a daily use fee, and then you weigh it when they come off the public land and say, oh, you got this many pounds of meteorites, so they're going to cost this much. And, once we kind of identified that, well, they were really looking at just the kind of the fee for use, that helped narrow it. But in the meantime, I had gone online and figured out that there's a very active market for meteorites online. If you go on eBay and search for meteorite, you will find all kinds. And the interesting thing from an appraiser standpoint is that it varies, the value varies by composition, whether it has more iron or more nickel, or what the meteorite consists of. Those can be a different price point in the meteorite market, if you want to say that. This would be more into our personal property appraisers, which I am not one, but that kind of thing, that they could definitely value a meteorite based on its content. And then the size is another thing. The bigger, of course, it's probably an inverse relationship to what we're used to for a size adjustment for meteorites. But
of course,
all of that kind of stuff, you just don't see that coming, and you're thinking, well, all right, well, how as an appraiser do I tackle this? How do I start looking at market evidence, or where do I find market evidence to try and come up with a defensible, credible opinion of value for the intended use?
That is absolutely amazing. And as you touched on, even the most complex or seemingly out of left field type of assignments, which you deal with some regularity. So it's just kind of like, oh, well, yeah, this is how we might think about it. Just gives pause for others to consider that sometimes it's not as distant as it may seem, because it's just following a framework for defining the problem, which is what you're touching on. It's like really defining what it is, not just what it seems like at first.
Yeah. And then as you mentioned before too, I mean, sometimes the scope and the scale of what we do can be pretty daunting. I mean, a lot of times, especially with the Bureau of Land Management, there's these large scale land exchanges where it's not unusual for us to have, 80,000 acres on each side of the land exchange that have to be appraised for, say, the department to exchange it with a state government, or there are some private owners that, not to that scale, but large scale land exchanges where it makes sense for the government to maybe they have lands that are in holdings within a private ownership that are unmanageable and they want to get rid of those lands, but they also want to get something in return. And so, oftentimes the landowner will, agree to go out and purchase certain properties to convey to the government in exchange, but those can be enormous in scale. And a lot of times they have oil and gas components. They may have water right components. There's a lot of variability, as you can imagine, on 80,000 acres. There's a lot of things can go on in 80,000 acres. And that's just on one side. There may be 80,000 acres on both sides. And sometimes those take a year to do the appraisals.
A year. Wait, Tim, let's just take that in. I know for you in your world, you're like, most people are probably living in a world where there might be like a couple hours, maybe a day, maybe a week or two. You just said a year.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you think about, if you got to appraise 160,000 acres scattered over various parts of a state, for you just to do the inspections is going to take some time. I mean, a lot of times they're done aerially, and nowadays they're done with drone. A lot of times we do have 2 licensed drone pilots on staff in Alaska that use drones to a great degree in their work. Yeah, there's a lot better ways to do it nowadays, but in the past, you would literally drive or hike to every one of those parcels. And then you've got to do all the data analysis and all the data gathering for almost a statewide appraisal, do all the normal appraisal stuff that we have to do, but on a scale of 80,000 acres. And so just the volume and size, it takes a long time. And of course, the fees are commensurate with it taking a year. I mean, they're not cheap and they're not fast, but we want it to get us right. And one thing you touched on before, and I kind of neglected to mention, is that especially on land acquisitions, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution requires payment of just compensation when the government acquires private property for public use. And so we're very focused on getting it right, because that rises to the highest level of legal authority in our country. If it's in the Constitution, it doesn't go any higher than that. And so, we feel we have an obligation to the landowners, we have an obligation to taxpayers and everybody that we get this right, because of that heightened level of responsibility that we have that's included in the Constitution. We take that very seriously, and oftentimes that complicates the process because it has to be done in a certain way that over 100 years, there's case law that says this is how you do the appraisal when you acquire this property. And so if you're all familiar with the Uniform Appraisal Standards for Federal Land Acquisition, or the Yellow Book, as it's frequently called, that's a compendium of case law and guidance from the Department of Justice on how to do an appraisal for a federal land acquisition. That's going to be a little bit beyond what we're all used to if we're not working with the federal government, but it's very prescriptive. It tells you exactly what you need to do. I like to say it gives you the recipe you need to have the cake turn out the way you want it to. You just have to follow it. There is a different level of scrutiny that's placed on the work we do than maybe there is for private appraisal practice.
Well, as you touched on, going all the way back to the Fifth like that makes a world of difference. And you made a reference earlier, which I think some people easily grasp, but other people probably missed. And you're like, well, it might be a land exchange. It's like 80,000 acres. And for most people, they just heard the number and it just kind of went by them. And to give people a perspective, for those of you that love sports, since we're into the fall time of the year right now, a football field is about an acre in size. If your city loves football, then you've got an acre, and a lot of people, maybe 30, 40, 50, 80,000 people, 100,000 people come and see that maybe every Sunday. But in this case, to give some reference for like 80,000, acres, that is either twice the size of like Cape Cod's National Seashore or half the size of Chicago, to give some perspective. Because people are like, how big is 80,000 acres? That's something else. That is a wild experience. And Tim, I appreciate you bringing up another interesting facet of work that, again, a lot of people have not likely had exposure to, and we refer to it as Yellow Book. Why do they call it Yellow Book, Tim?
Because the cover is yellow.
Yeah, I mean, keep it simple, stupid. I mean, that's what it's all about. And then, as you touched on, it is a unique set of guidelines, client guidelines for the valuation of property. And there are a lot of individuals that can have the opportunity to get involved in that. And there's some coursework you can take, and there's an opportunity to get involved in some organizations. Are there any organizations that you find better to be associated with, Tim, if someone doesn't work for the federal government and they want to learn about Yellow Book?
I mean, I've taken a lot of the courses that are offered, the 3 providers that I've recommended to others. And the Appraisal Institute has good Yellow Book courses. The American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers has Yellow Book courses, and McKissick has some Yellow Book courses also that are very, very well done. Those are a good, kind of I think there's a couple of them that are, 1 day or 2 days available online, kind of as an intro. It's a complex document. I had the pleasure of working on the last revision. The 6th edition was published in 2016, and I helped with the Interagency Land Acquisition Conference that publishes that. I got the opportunity to work on the revisions of the Yellow Book. They redesigned it in 2016 to follow USPAP more closely, or look a lot more like USPAP. But it is, if you're doing Yellow Book work, that's the key. It's available for free online through the Department of Justice, but there's also PDF versions that are searchable and things like that through the Appraisal Foundation, who's publishing it now. So there's ways to get it. Any of our staff, if you happen to be having 115 appraisers, we're always involved in continuing education somewhere. If you have an interest in the Yellow Book and there's somebody from our office in class, or from any other federal agency for that matter, they can probably help clue you in on opportunities to work, do Yellow Book appraisals. But it's definitely I would say an underexploited niche. It does require a little bit different approach because the requirements are different. And back to when USPAP had the supplemental standards rule, which has been gone for quite a while, Yellow Book is essentially a supplemental standard to USPAP. You have to comply with USPAP first, and then for a federal land acquisition, you're complying with these additional standards that have been established, assignment condition, for lack of a better term. And there aren't a lot of huge differences, but there are some significant differences, like sales history. It's 10 years in the Yellow Book versus 3 years in USPAP. There's some technical things like that, but a lot of it is just making sure that assignments done under the Yellow Book, things are supported. There's none of this trust me stuff. It's like, it's got to be lined out. As an appraiser, you've got to write the narrative report, and you've got to explain your logic and your thinking and the support for your adjustments and things like that. So, but I think generally once you get a template set up, just like any type of appraisal, it's not any more onerous than it is to do another type of appraisal.
That is a helpful supporting comment for people that first might have been overwhelmed by the answer and then realizing it kind of dovetails back in.
Yeah.
Speaking of dovetailing back in that first episode, you briefly made reference to 2 things, and I have a hunch you've got some stories around both of them. You mentioned that one of the responsibilities that you've had in the federal government is involving Indian land. And I don't know that a lot of people know that there's a certain amount of land here in the United States that is not exactly what you think it is, or it's not owned by who you think it is. And then separately, you also mentioned being involved in Hawaii and some of the actions over there. What comes to mind when you think about some of the responsibilities for valuing land that is, let's say, not part of the United States, but is part of the United States?
Yeah, our work in Indian country is critical. Well, so there's different levels of ownership of what we refer to as Indian country in the department. And there's tribal lands, which are owned and managed by the particular tribes. And then there's individual Indian-owned lands that are usually allotments that were created by the Dawes Act back in the 1800s. And those particular lands, the allotted lands, the government has a trust responsibility. Those lands are actually held in trust by the United States on behalf of the beneficial Indian landowners. And so a lot of times when we're appraising those things, it's to ensure that the Indian landowners are treated fairly and that there is the government's responsibility to ensure through that trust responsibility that those lands are valued properly. Rights of way is one of the big areas where that happens, where a company wants to put a pipeline across individual Indian-owned lands, and we're responsible for the appraisals to determine what the compensation due to the Indian landowner for the use of that property. The say a pipeline company, they may have their own ideas what it's worth, but there's specific regulations that we have to follow on how we determine what the compensation is for that Indian landowner. Another area we're involved in is that there are 36 tribes currently that either have contracts or compacts with the United States to manage their own appraisal programs. And so we fund those to the tune of about $2 million a year for those 36 programs, and help them with training and providing any additional expertise and sometimes review of their appraisals. But those are all managed by the individual tribes that have assumed that self-governance activity of, and it's not just appraisal. They do wildlife management, geology. There's a lot of different things that they've assumed responsibility for under these self-governance programs. And our role is supporting of those and funding of those. Those are rewarding because it helps ensure tribal sovereignty for those tribes. It's a self-governance activity that we take very seriously, that we're there to help, but we're not there to basically run their program for them. We're giving them the opportunity as a sovereign nation to manage their program, but we're there to help and assist if we can.
And then how does one who's never done an assignment, first of all, they shouldn't do it, but obviously partner up with someone who's competent. But what's involved with valuing various levels of Indian or tribal land? Because, we'll go ahead. I mean, I won't lead to where you're going, but it's a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, it can be challenging. And I know I've spoken with other federal agencies that have a real challenge in finding appraisers that are willing to work in Indian country. And some of it is that trust responsibility where the land's held in trust, even for lending purposes for residential. There's only a few lenders that operate in Indian country because of that kind of bifurcation of the ownership of the property. It does require a special level of expertise to, do those in a way that, recognizes that there is some ownership here, there is collateral here. Can we, figure out a way to, lend based on what is there, what the individual Indian landowner owns, with this kind of oversight by, this trust responsibility by the United States. It's a challenge, but there are, in areas where there's reservations, you'll find appraisers that are familiar with that. I know the VA works in Indian country, the USDA, rural housing, some of the other lenders, and I don't know if there's any conventional lenders or not, but it does create a challenge to Indian landowners who need financing to find a lender that's willing to do what they need, and also an appraiser for that lender that knows the nuances of working in Indian country.
Yeah, that's a fascinating nuance, that the land is held in trust by the U.S. and that definitely influences if someone can even get a loan on such property.
Yeah, and that's been an ongoing challenge, and I know it's any of the federal agencies that have appraisers on staff. It's been an ongoing challenge to figure out how to quickly meet the needs of borrowers in Indian country. We don't get involved in the borrowing piece of it. Is a good thing, but that doesn't alleviate the need for lending appraisals in Indian country.
No, that's fascinating. Speaking of fascinating, you've also been involved in some work in Hawaii, you mentioned.
Yeah. Actually, our office does a fair amount of work. We've worked in Hawaii on different projects. We recently had somebody in Guam doing an appraisal in Guam. The only other federal agency that has better stuff in the Pacific than us is Navy. They do a lot of work in South Pacific, Micronesia, those type of areas. But Hawaii's definitely one of my favorite areas to have worked in. A lot of it goes back to, in terms of history, the fairly recent change from a kingdom of Hawaii to becoming a state, being annexed and becoming a state. And so oftentimes when you're working there, you find royal patents that are still, maybe the last transfer of land was a royal patent from King Kamehameha to some landowner. Yeah, and I mean, they're very cool documents. They're handwritten, you've probably seen them. But I've had the opportunity to work on a couple of really cool cases for the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations. One was a land exchange between the state of Hawaii and their Department of Natural or Native Hawaiian Relations and the city and county of Honolulu, which involved the rail hub for the mass transit system in Honolulu, sits on Department of Native Hawaiian Relations land. And they wanted to exchange that for some land that was over by Pearl Harbor for housing development for Native Hawaiians. And this thing had been stalled out for quite a period of time because both sides were trying to manipulate the appraisal process to get a better outcome.
Tim, do people do that? Manipulate the appraisal process for a better outcome? That seems shocking.
Oh, I know. No appraiser has ever experienced that. But they had just been arguing back and forth. And to complicate it further, they had each signed agreements with the other side to allow them to use the property that was going to eventually be exchanged while this was all going on. And so for 10 years, you had uses happening that were authorized through an agreement. Then when we go to exchange the properties, it's like, well, all right, now what do we have here? What do we look at? And this rail facility in Honolulu is a huge thing. I mean, it's like $1 billion facility. Of course, they're saying, well, you have to take that into account. And we're like, well, if you're exchanging land for land, when was the agreement to exchange the land made? And so we worked through the process and kind of said, yeah, okay, why don't we do a retrospective appraisal, look at when the agreement happened, kind of go back to some earlier appraisal work that had been done several years ago. And then the big thing was let us control the process so that the two sides aren't fighting. If the two sides will agree to let us manage the appraisal process, we'll make sure that it's fair to both sides and that any decision that we're making about a hypothetical condition or an extraordinary assumption in any assignment conditions are reasonable and fair to both sides. And so sort of after this thing kind of been kicking around for a long time, we were able to kind of take control of the situation, get everybody on board, draft the statement of work for the appraiser, get it signed off on by everybody involved, a lot of wrangling. But we did finally get the appraisals completed and approved. And I think I'm not sure the decision has been made finally yet, but our piece is done. We got done what we needed to get done and moved it forward. And I'm thankful for that we were able to help out in a big way to make that happen. We've had some other situations where surplus land comes up in Hawaii from another government agency. And I got to be involved in some work over by Pearl Harbor again. That was a former monitoring station, or they had some antennas on it or different things like that no longer were necessary. And there was an opportunity for the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations to acquire that property again to develop housing for Native Hawaiians. And we got involved with the director of that office at the time, and we were able to work through some issues and come up with at least an analysis that said, the price that was needed to be paid for the surplus property being offered, definitely it was worth it for them to acquire the property based on, some valuation work that we did. So loved working on those projects. We've had staff on most of the islands. Kauai, there's a big refuge on Kauai that I'm very familiar with. We had another appraiser in Maui not too long ago that was working on a big acquisition of a ranch to add on to a national park. So yeah, there's some really cool stuff. We've done some work in the Caribbean too, in Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. Those aren't as common. Hawaii is a fairly active market. Those kind of things are really, really cool to get an opportunity to work on. Hawaii is just, if you haven't researched the land, and this is totally an appraiser nerd thing, but if you haven't researched kind of the land tenure patterns in Hawaii and the way it evolved, the way it did, it's very interesting, very unique, and how those royal grants were conveyed.
It's one of those where if you didn't know about it or had somebody tell you about it or hear a story, the vast majority of people, they have no sense of it. I had a similar story when I was asked about illegal communication someone received, and it was involving Puerto Rico. And look, I don't know much about Puerto Rico, but I learned quickly. And one of the fascinating things to your comment about the history of Hawaii is the land rights in Puerto Rico follow from the Kingdom of Spain, which why would I ever know that? I mean, I'm just thinking, well, I don't know, like you buy and sell, there's a deed, there's things that happen, it kind of goes that way. They're like, Yeah, it's a little different down here. And I'm like, holy cow. Well, I have no idea what I'm talking about, and I'm clearly not the right person. But, as a member of an organization, I can go on their website, and some people I've met in classes, I can easily refer you to someone who does know something, because my effort to at least try to be helpful clearly is just making a mess. So I should quickly get out of the way. And they got in touch with someone who, as you touched on, is in that location, knows histories, knows how to research, understands not everything looks just like it is back home, because their home is a different view of our home, and ultimately take care of what, in this case, client needed. But boy, that was such an important reminder.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we rely so heavily on contract appraisers or private fee appraisers to do work for us. Is the scope of what the Department of Interior manages is huge. And if we don't have the expertise, and we spend a lot more time trying to build that expertise or becoming competent to do the assignment than if we just hire somebody local that already has that knowledge, has the market connections, knows where to get the information, understands the nuances of those particular markets. So on the federal land side, we contract out, I would say, about 95% of the assignments that we do. Part of it is because of that additional, constitutional requirement for just compensation. We want to make sure that those are done by someone with that local knowledge. A lot of the work we do in Indian country, we actually do in-house. We have it's probably about 80% of our in-house or our Indian country work is done in-house. Some of that touches on what you said, is that particular knowledge of working in Indian country and the trust relationship and the split ownership. Our staff is very aware of that. And a lot of times those are more for leases or rights of way or, other things than an acquisition that's bound under that just compensation requirement. So we kind of have two different business models depending on which side of the operations we're working in. But on the federal land side, definitely we contract out the vast majority of the work we do to local experts that have that knowledge and expertise. We've built that up internally in Indian country, but on the federal land side, we typically contract that out.
Tim, this is absolutely fascinating. As we kind of move into wrap up with another just extremely informative and engaging version 2, if you will, or say episode 2 in our 1 of 2 segment series. If people do want to learn more about this, or they're intrigued, they're like, hey, I really like birds. I could do some valuation in that space. Or they're like, you know what? I love alligator teeth. We could do some dating on those and figure out some genealogy. And I could even apply my appraisal skills. What would be some steps people could take to start to learn a little bit more about it? Because one of our commitments here in this podcast is not only to provide a broader understanding of just the very interesting roles that some of our peers get to perform in, but also to provide insight into there's so many more valuation puzzles that get solved in a given year that don't just look like a little retail strip or somebody's house. And it's an insight to those not only in the profession, but maybe those that are considering getting into it. So what concluding comments might you share to help them consider what we call maybe diversifying and specializing?
Yeah, I think a good first step is if you go onto your search engine preference and type in Appraisal and Valuation Services Office, we should come up on there. And there's a lot more information about our office and the type of work we do. And I would point you specifically to, we have a section on like past projects that we've done, and it shows some of the diversity of information that, or types of assignments that we've worked on recently and kind of what the outcome was. And there's some really diverse things in there. I mean, there's things you wouldn't necessarily expect, but there's a few pictures too. If we were doing this as part of a presentation, I always figure we have the best spaces anywhere, so I can share pictures of where we work.
I love it.
But I would start with the website. And then the other thing is, if you are at a class or something and there's somebody from our office, just ask questions. I know all of our staff would be more than happy to talk to you about work needed or how we might have needs in a particular area. But those are the key things to find out more. Or you can always contact me. I'm around. I'm available. Also on the website, there is another section about contractors that might be interested in working with us. That's available on the website as well. And there's always a need, especially if you're interested in Yellow Book or willing to do work. compliant with Yellow Book, we're always looking for vendors. So yeah, feel free to reach out to any of us. And the other thing, I just close a little bit by saying some of the stories I've told you about weird assignments that pop up, don't say no immediately. I mean, you may not know exactly how you're going to tackle it, but oftentimes those lead to some of the most interesting, exciting, valuable assignments that we get tasked with. So just because you've never done it before, there's somebody out there that's done it before, and just be open to those possibilities, because oftentimes those are where the growth happens. Those are where the learning happens, and those are where the life experiences happen that make it worthwhile.
Hey, and who knew that holding the dumb end of the tape measure for mom and getting a mechanical pencil with an architectural hat there just, could turn into an opportunity to lead the Department of Interior and get to be involved in such fascinating valuation puzzles that need to be solved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm thankful every day that it worked out the way it did. And I'm a very firm believer in things work out the way they're supposed to. And so, rather than, working in the forensic lab and dealing with all kinds of stinky stuff that brought in by the game wardens, I get to manage a great appraisal organization with a ton of great employees and a mission that we all are invested in and we all support. And so I'm thankful for that every day.
I appreciate that. Thanks for the work that you do, and thanks for sharing some insight and next steps for those that might be interested. We want to appreciate our peers that have offered some feedback, and they said, hey, I know that there's some very interesting individuals in the profession. Would love to hear those kind of stories. And this is a direct result from some of those requests. So Ramiro, I want to say thanks for asking for that, and hope you are swimming in Yellow Book as a result of Tim's very generous sharing. And with that, we're going to be bringing this second episode with Tim to a close. Thank you again for continuing to click the like button and share this with peers. We've even had some people asking about 2024 schedule, even maybe doing some couple live recordings at some of the upcoming conferences and seminars. And, we always like to keep it open. This is really about paying it forward. It's an opportunity for those that have either been in the profession to gain more perspective, or those that are new in the profession or newer, to understand the breadth and even depth of opportunities that are out there that look maybe significantly different from what you're doing now, and possibly for those that are thinking about a change and their natural talents and abilities are a great fit for this industry. It's the opportunity to hear from some peers that you might never get a chance to meet in person, but you get a little bit closer to them, a little better understanding. So Tim, thanks for being one of those today, and I look forward to seeing you in person here soon.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Paru Zings, Appraisers on Purpose. We hope you enjoyed learning from the amazing life paths and achievements of our guests. Don't forget to like us on LinkedIn and other podcast channels to hear more from appraisers and valuers regarding their life and their work. If you have any suggestions or questions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Just send us a message on LinkedIn and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks again for listening, and until we're together again for the next session of Paru Zings, Appraisers on Purpose, create the change that you seek.